The night the SHU went silent, the moment the lights shut off inside the Pelican Bay SHU, Marcus felt the kind of fear that doesn't come a warning. It struck instantly, like a punch to the chest. The entire unit dropped into pitch-black silence, a kind of darkness so total that even the memory of light seemed erased. Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit is designed to never go fully dark. Lights are kept on 24 hours a day to disrupt sleep, keep inmates docile, and allow officers to see everything. Darkness is not part of the design, yet tonight it consumed everything. Marcus sat upright on his concrete bunk, eyes wide open but seeing absolutely nothing. The silence outside his cell was even worse than the darkness. There were no officers talking in the hallway, no metallic clanging of doors, no distant yelling from other inmates. It was as if the entire building had stopped breathing. He slowly stood up, pressing one hand against the wall to steady himself. His heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud, echoing inside his head. Even his own breathing sounded like it didn't belong in the space. He moved toward the steel door, stretching out his fingers until they touched the cold metal. He pressed his ear against it, hoping to catch even the smallest sound. There was nothing. No footsteps. No radios. Absolute stillness. A place like Pelican Bay is never truly silent, and that alone terrified him. Then, out of nowhere, a slow, dragging sound traveled across the hallway floor. It was soft at first, almost like someone pulling fabric. But then it grew louder and heavier, like something was crawling its way toward him. Marcus whispered, "Who's there?" but instantly regretted it. His own voice felt too loud in the dead silence. The dragging sound paused, as if whatever was making it had heard him. Then it started again, slower this time, as if inching closer. When it finally stopped outside his cell door, Marcus held his breath. The hallway was so silent, he could hear the pounding of his heartbeat between his ears. That's when he heard it, his name, whispered so softly that the building wasn't silent. He would have missed it. Marcus. He jumped back instantly, hitting the wall behind him. The voice was impossible to explain. No one inside the SHU was allowed to speak, and guards certainly didn't whisper names in the dark. Before he could say anything, the voice spoke again. "We need to talk." Marcus felt his knees go weak. He tried to make sense of the moment, but before he could process it, the overhead lights snapped back on with a violent, buzzing glare. The brightness hurt his eyes, forcing to shield his face. But when he looked toward the hallway window, the corridor was empty. No guards, no shadows, nothing. Yet a new detail sent a chill down his spine. Etched into the hallway floor, scratched deep into the concrete, was a message. "You're next." He backed away from the door slowly, pulse racing. Nothing made sense. Who wrote it? How? Why? And what did next even mean? He swallowed hard, staring at the message as the humming of the lights returned overhead. The SHU felt different now, less like a prison, and more like a place that had started watching him. Marcus realized one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever whispered his name in the dark was not finished with him. The box they built to break you. Marcus had been through rough prisons before, places where fights broke out in the yard, where noise never stopped, where chaos felt normal. But Pelican Bay was different. From the moment the transport van rolled up to the gate, he felt something colder than fear settle in his stomach. The guards barely looked at him as they shackled him tight and walked him through a maze of identical corridors. Every door they passed through slammed shut behind him with a heavy finality, echoing through concrete halls meant to erase hope. Nothing here was meant to comfort. Nothing was meant to distract. The SHU was built for one purpose: control. When they finally stopped and ordered him into his new cell, Marcus stepped into a concrete box barely larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were plain, colorless, and so smooth they looked polished by time and despair. The bed was a concrete platform with a thin mattress. The toilet and sink were fused steel, cold to the touch and loud whenever he used them. The tiny window high on the wall didn't show scenery or sunlight, just a pale slice of sky angled, so he could never see outside. It wasn't meant to give hope. It was meant to remind him how small his world now was. The first hours felt long, but the first days felt endless. Time in the SHU had no shape. The light stayed on all day and all night, humming softly like a swarm of bees trapped overhead. Marcus tried everything to maintain sanity. Push-ups, pacing, counting steps, but the silence in between each movement pressing on him like a living thing. He had never experienced this kind of quiet before. There was no chatter, no yelling, no banging, just a vacuum of sound that made his own thoughts seem too loud. By the third day, Marcus noticed the way the isolation got inside his head. He started remembering things that didn't matter, replaying moments from his past, as if his brain was desperate for voices. He spoke out loud just to hear something, even if it was only his own voice. But nothing prepared him for the first night. He heard the tapping behind the wall. It was faint at first, one small tap, then another, then silence. He told himself it was pipes. Buildings make noises. But the next night, at the exact same time, the tapping returned. Same rhythm, same pause, same deliberate pattern. Each night, it grew slightly louder, like whatever was making the noise was creeping closer. One night, frustrated and running low on patience, Marcus whispered, "Stop." The tapping stopped instantly. The sudden silence felt like someone had answered him. Not a random sound, not a building settling, but something listening. Marcus sat in his bunk staring at the wall, trying to decide if he was imagining things or if the SHU was beginning to twist reality. But the next morning, when he found a folded piece of paper tucked under his door, something that should have been impossible, his doubts grew stronger. The note had only 2 words written in messy handwriting: "Be ready." He stared at the message for a long time. Ready for what? A fight? A transfer? A setup? But no explanation came. Instead, the tapping returned that night, stronger and closer. Marcus pressed his ear to the cold wall and whispered, "What do you want?" The air, coming through a thin crack, felt colder than the rest of the cell. Then a soft voice whispered back to the concrete, so faint he almost doubted he heard it at all. "You're not alone." The next morning, everything felt different. The lights seemed harsher. The silence felt heavier. Even the air tasted colder. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something in the SHU was watching him. Not through the cameras, not through the guards, but through the walls. As he paced, he felt small changes. The concrete seemed to vibrate slightly at odd moments, and sometimes the wall directly behind his bunk felt colder than the others, as if something pressed against it from the other side. The SHU wasn't just isolating him. It was surrounding him, studying him, examining what silence would do to him. Marcus tried to focus on reality, on routines, on time, on anything solid, but the tapping kept returning every night. It always began at the same moment, always following the same rhythm. Each time he tried to ignore it, it grew louder. Each time he acknowledged it, the tapping moved closer to where he rested his head. He began to understand why inmates in the SHU cracked. It wasn't because they were weak. It was because the environment was engineered to test the limits of the human mind. And now something behind the wall was testing him. He sat on his bunk, staring at the smooth gray concrete across from him, wondering if the SHU was breaking him or preparing him. He could feel something coming, but whether it was danger, insight, or madness, he couldn't tell. The note under his door still sat on the floor beside the toilet. Be ready? He didn't know what he was supposed to be ready for, but he could tell the SHU wasn't finished with him. Not even close. The rules no one tells you. Marcus learned quickly that Pelican Bay's SHU had rules that were never written down, but were enforced just as tightly as the official ones. The first rule was simple. Sound is dangerous. Every noise carried a meaning. A cough could get the attention of the wrong guard. A whisper could earn you a disciplinary write-up. Even footsteps mattered. You learned which officers walked heavily and which ones moved silently enough to make your heart jump. Marcus paid attention to everything because in the SHU, your survival often depended on recognizing patterns before they turned into problems. The SHU made men desperate for connection, but it punished connection at the same time. Some inmates tried to talk through their vents, their voices echoing to the metal like ghosts trapped in the ductwork. Others banged on their doors out of frustration or madness, but the ones who had been there long enough knew to stay quiet. Marcus found himself caught between needing silence to stay out of trouble and craving any sign, that he wasn't the only person left in the world. It was during one of these silent stretches that he first heard the voice from down the tier. Not yelling, not angry, just a short, strained cry for help that cut through the air before being swallowed by silence again. It reminded him that even in a place built for isolation, someone else was living an identical nightmare only a few feet away. He tried to keep a routine to protect his mind. Push-ups, lunges, counting cracks in the ceiling. Some days, he traced the same square of concrete with his finger for hours just to feel like he still had control over something. But the SHU was designed to unravel routines. The lights never changed. The meals arrived without rhythm. The guards walked the tier randomly, sometimes stopping outside his door for no reason at all, their shadows blocking the thin line of light under the frame. Even sleep wasn't reliable. The constant brightness made it impossible to tell how long he slept or whether the blurred time was actually affecting him. One day, while Marcus was lying on his bunk staring at the ceiling, he heard someone down the tier start screaming that they were losing their mind. The sound was raw and desperate, echoing through concrete walls that weren't meant to carry emotion. The guards responded not with concern, but with commands, shouting at the man to knock it off or deal with it. Eventually, the screaming turned to sobbing. Then it faded out completely. Marcus never heard that voice again. The next morning, the cell door down the tier stayed closed during chow, and no one explained why. Marcus realized then that men didn't always leave the SHU. When their time was up, sometimes the SHU simply outlasted them. As the days continued, Marcus noticed how silence wasn't the only weapon. The guards used time against inmates too. Sometimes they would be late with meals, leaving men to wonder if they had been forgotten. Other times they would rush so quickly that the food slot slammed shut before Marcus even reached it. During showers, he was walked down the hall cuff-controlled and watched by multiple officers who barely acknowledged his existence. The shower wasn't relaxing. It was just another box, another door, another reminder that he was a body being managed, not a human being cared for. Eventually, Marcus began hearing faint sounds through the vent in his cell. Sometimes it was breathing. Sometimes it was a voice humming a tune he didn't recognize. Sometimes it was just a long, low sigh like someone was sitting inches away on the other side of the duct, waiting for something to happen. He tried telling himself it was just the building settling or the wind or the ventilation system struggling against old machinery. But the more he listened, the more the sounds felt intentional. They weren't constant. They came only when Marcus was quiet, as if the SHU were waiting for silence to speak. The strangest part was how the tapping on the wall and the sounds in the vent never happened at the same time. When the tapping grew stronger, the vent stayed silent. When the vent carried a breath or a hum, the tapping vanished completely. It felt organized, coordinated, almost like two different things were taking turns observing him. Marcus tried not to think about that theory too much, but in the SHU, where silence magnified every fear, it was impossible not to consider all possibilities. At night, the noises always grew sharper. Marcus would lie still on his mattress, listening to the hall, trying to figure out where each sound came from. The vent would exhale a faint hum. The walls would creak under pressure. Farther down the tier, someone would whisper a word or two before being shushed by a guard. The combination created a strange harmony that made Marcus wonder whether the SHU was building up to something. Each sound felt like the start of a message he wasn't yet able to understand. He tried to remember what normal life felt like. Conversation, sunlight, open air. But each memory felt distant, like a dream he once had and forgot too quickly. The SHU made the outside world feel like fiction. Even time behaved differently. Sometimes an hour felt like a day. Sometimes a whole afternoon vanished before he realized he'd been pacing for so long that his feet hurt. He began losing track of which memories were real, which fears were imagined, and which sounds actually existed outside his mind. One night, while staring at the dim reflection of his face in the metal toilet, Marcus admitted something terrifying to himself. The SHU was starting to feel alive. It responded to his movements. It waited for his silence. It pressed in on him when he tried to think. Whether it was psychological breakdown or something more, he couldn't be sure. But something was happening inside these walls, something that went deeper than punishment or isolation. Marcus knew then that the warning from the note, "Be ready," wasn't random. Someone or something had prepared him for the storm the SHU was building around him, and whatever whispered his name in the dark hadn't finished with him yet. The psychological impact of complete isolation. Life inside the Pelican Bay SHU followed a strict operational routine, but beneath that routine lay a psychological landscape far more damaging than most people outside the prison system could ever imagine. For Marcus, the most immediate change wasn't physical. It was mental. Time behaved differently here. Without clocks, sunlight, or any form of natural rhythm to guide him, minutes seemed to stretch into hours, and days dissolved into something impossible to measure. This wasn't accidental. The SHU was engineered to control sensory input. Lights that never turn off, silence that absorbs every sound, and thick concrete walls that keep inmates locked inside their own minds. Experts who study solitary confinement point out that the SHU's architecture is designed to manage behavior. But inmates describe it differently. They say the cell reshapes their sense of reality. Marcus experienced this firsthand. The smooth concrete, the steel toilet sink combination, and the narrow upward-facing window created an environment without stimulation. The absence of color, motion, and human presence slowly began stripping away the mental anchors he relied on his entire life. He started replaying old memories to keep himself connected to something outside the cell. As weeks passed, Marcus began showing symptoms commonly associated with long-term isolation, restlessness that made him pace without realizing, anxiety that arrived without a clear trigger, and moments of dissociation where hours felt like seconds or seconds felt like entire mornings. Medical research describes this as sensory starvation. Inside the SHU, the brain reaches for anything, patterns in concrete, the hum of lights, the faint echo of footsteps, to stay grounded. Marcus often caught himself whispering random memories just so his own voice could fill the silence. Eventually, Marcus learned something many documentary researchers emphasize. In the SHU, silence becomes louder than noise. Every faint sound became amplified. A vent turning on, a cart rolling down the hallway, the occasional thump from a distant cell. Marcus listened to these noises like a man starving for company. The ventilation system became a strange companion. He could tell when airflow shifted, when the building settled, and when someone moved on the tier, even if he couldn't see them. The silence around those moments made each one feel like a small lifeline to reality. Guards operated on strict routines, but they rarely spoke during rounds unless necessary. Instructions were given in short, clipped tones. Even moments of eye contact were rare. This wasn't personal. It was part of institutional culture. Limiting conversation reduced tension and prevented emotional attachment. For Marcus, this distance created a strange psychological effect. A simple nod during meal delivery felt like a moment of meaningful human contact. A glance during a welfare check felt like acknowledgement that he still existed. Like many SHU inmates, Marcus also felt the physical effects of isolation. Lack of sunlight weakened his body, disrupted his circadian rhythm, and made him tired during the day but restless at night. His muscles felt stiffer despite daily exercise. His appetite fluctuated. The cell environment didn't scream at him or strike him, but it slowly wore down his body through monotony and stillness. Specialists refer to this as institutional fatigue, a slow decline caused not by violence, but by the absence of stimulation. What made Pelican Bay's SHU so infamous and so compelling for documentaries around the world was how it broke inmates not through force, but through structure. Marcus realized the design wasn't meant simply to isolate inmates. It was meant to erode the mind gently, predictably, and quietly. The lights didn't change. The silence didn't lift. The walls never shifted. The sameness was a punishment. As Marcus lay on his bunk at the end of another day that looked identical to last, he finally understood the warning from the note that had appeared under his door. Be ready, not for violence, but for what isolation was slowly turning him into. The routine that breaks men slowly. The daily routine inside Pelican Bay's SHU was designed to appear simple, almost harmless, but every part of it carried a psychological weight that slowly wore down even the strongest inmates. Marcus soon realized that the structure was intentional. Wake up under bright lights. Eat alone. Exercise alone. Think alone. Sleep under the same bright lights. Repeat. The sameness was an oversight. It was a punishment. In documentaries, experts often describe solitary confinement as a prison inside a prison. But Marcus understood that the SHU went further. It wasn't just the absence of freedom. It was the absence of any variation at all. Meals were pushed through a slot with little human interaction. Guards rarely spoke beyond short commands, and even those were delivered without tone or emotion. Marcus learned to anticipate the exact sound of food cart wheels, the clang of the metal tray slot, and the brief flicker of shadows under the door. Each tray looked identical. Bland food served in molded compartments. The same colors, the same textures, day after day. The routine stripped meals of enjoyment and turned eating into another mechanical action. Marcus wasn't being fed to live. He was being fed to continue the cycle. Shower days came only every few days, and even then, the process was rigid and isolating. Marcus would be ordered to turn his back, kneel, and be handcuffed through the slot before the door opened. He was escorted to a shower cage, a small, concrete booth with steel bars and a timer-controlled water stream. He was supervised from outside, but never spoken to. The detergent smelled the same every time, and the water was either too cold or lukewarm. Even the act of washing, normally a moment of refreshment, felt like another controlled, impersonal task. Exercise yard followed the same mental pattern. Instead of open fields or social interaction, Marcus was placed inside a small concrete pen the size of a parking space, surrounded by tall walls and topped with steel mesh. The only glimpse of the outside world was a patch of sky that sometimes changed color, but even that felt distant. He walked in circles for the full hour, listening to the faint echoes of other inmates doing the same in their own isolated pens. Experts interviewed in documentaries often mention that SHU yards are outdoor cells, and Marcus understood the phrase immediately. Even outside felt like confinement. Over time, Marcus noticed that the SHU's routine didn't just control behavior. It affected thought patterns. The lack of change meant his brain had nothing new to process. Days felt identical, so memories blurred together. He found himself unsure whether something had happened yesterday or the week before. Many inmates described this as the fog, and Marcus now understood what they meant. He wasn't losing intelligence. He was losing stimulation. Without sensory variation, the mind began dissolving in slow motion. Medical reports have long documented the effects of long-term solitary confinement. Anxiety, insomnia, hallucinations, emotional numbness, and acute stress responses. Marcus experienced all of them. Some nights he couldn't sleep at all. Other nights he woke up suddenly, convinced he'd heard something. He became more sensitive to small irritations, light buzzing, distant footsteps, faint echoes. His heart raced at unexpected sounds and sank at the long stretches of nothingness. The SHU didn't need violence to break man. It used monotony as a weapon. The longer he stayed, the more Marcus understood that the SHU wasn't designed to punish one action. It was designed to reshape behavior entirely. It wasn't about enforcing order. It was about enforcing stillness. No choices, no movement, no unpredictability. Just the same day repeated endlessly until the inmate either submitted or fractured. Marcus felt himself teetering between those outcomes, balancing on the edge of a psychological cliff the SHU had created for him. The mental consequences no one talks about. The psychological damage caused by Pelican Bay's SHU wasn't something that appeared suddenly. It built itself slowly, quietly, and relentlessly. Marcus noticed the first real shift. We began reacting to sounds that weren't there. A faint buzz in the lights made his heart race. A distant echo made him stand up suddenly. When nothing followed, he felt embarrassed but also frightened. Experts have described these reactions as hypervigilance, an enhanced survival instinct triggered by long-term isolation. Inmates start listening for danger even when danger isn't present. But in the SHU, the absence of noise often meant more than its presence. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus found himself drifting into thoughts that didn't feel entirely like his own. He wasn't losing touch with reality, but reality was losing its grip on him. He started imagining conversations with people from his past, old friends, family members, even people he barely remembered. These weren't hallucinations. They were coping mechanisms. The SHU starved him of social interaction so thoroughly that his brain created it artificially. He caught himself smiling at memories not because they were pleasant, but because they made him feel like he wasn't disappearing. One of the hardest parts of SHU life was the emotional confusion it created. Marcus would go days feeling completely numb, his mind shutting down any reaction to preserve itself. But then, without warning, he would feel an overwhelming rush of anxiety or sadness that made him pace the room for hours. This emotional whiplash is well documented among inmates in long-term isolation. When the brain loses consistent stimulation, it begins to create its own. Marcus started to feel trapped not only by the walls, but by the unpredictable state of his own emotions. Sleep became another battle. With the lights always on, Marcus struggled to understand when his body needed rest. Some nights he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to calm his mind enough to sleep. Other nights, he fell into restless periods of half-sleep, where he wasn't fully awake, but not fully unconscious either. His dreams became strange blends of memories and fears. He often woke unsure whether something had happened in real life or only in his mind. This blurring effect is common in inmates deprived of natural day-night cycles. Marcus also began noticing problems with memory. Simple details became difficult to recall. Dates, times, conversations, everything blurred. Sometimes he couldn't remember whether he had eaten breakfast that day or the day before. His internal clock had shattered completely. Researchers call this temporal disorientation, a condition frequently observed in solitary confinement. Without markers of time, the mind stops tracking it. Marcus wasn't imagining things. His brain was trying to cope with the SHU's design, and it was losing ground. What frightened Marcus most wasn't what was happening to him. It was watching it happen to others. Through the vent or during rare escort moments, he heard men talking to themselves for hours, laughing at nothing, or suddenly breaking down into muffled sobs. Some began yelling threats at people who weren't there, convinced they were being watched or targeted. Others simply stopped talking altogether. Marcus understood these men weren't weak. They were responding to an environment engineered to crush the psyche. He knew that if he stayed long enough, he could become one of them. By the end of his 5th month, Marcus realized the SHU didn't just punish people. It erased versions of them. The man who walked into that cell wasn't the same man waking up there now. His patience was thinner. His thoughts were scattered. His hope came in flickers. Isolation wasn't breaking him violently. It was breaking him slowly, invisibly, cell by cell, minute by minute. And the worst part was knowing no one outside those walls would understand what this place could do to a human mind. The truth about the SHU. In the end, Marcus's story wasn't unique. It wasn't rare, and it wasn't an accident. What happened to him inside the Pelican Bay, SHU represents what thousands of men have faced for decades inside one of the most extreme isolation units in the United States. Behind those thick concrete walls, the punishment isn't delivered through violence, chaos, or confrontation. It is delivered quietly, slowly, methodically, through silence, sameness, and the complete removal of human contact. Every hallway in the SHU carries the echoes of men who came before, voices that faded, routines that collapsed, identities that dissolved under the pressure of 23 hours a day alone in a concrete box. The world outside rarely hears those stories. And the system doesn't advertise what long-term isolation truly does to the mind. But men like Marcus feel the impact long after the door finally opens. Some leave angrier. Some leave broken. Some never fully return to themselves. What makes Pelican Bay's SHU so powerful and so controversial is that it doesn't need chains, noise, or brutality to create suffering. The environment itself is the punishment, the light that never turns off, the silence that never lifts, the routine that never changes, the days that blur together until the inmate forgets how long he's been there or who he was before he arrived. Experts call it environmental pressure. Marcus called it losing pieces of yourself you never get back. Documentaries often focus on the headlines: violence, gangs, escapes. But the real story inside Pelican Bay isn't about explosions of chaos. It's about the slow, invisible collapse that happens when a human mind is denied what it needs most: connection, variation, and sunlight. The SHU proves something important. You don't have to see pain for it to exist. Sometimes the deepest suffering happens in silence. Marcus's journey through isolation shows what happens when a system built for control becomes a machine that changes people from the inside out. And whether you believe the SHU is necessary for safety or a punishment too extreme for a civilized society, one truth remains impossible to deny. No one walks out of Pelican Bay's SHU the same person who walked in.